All right, Jabosai, good morning. So today's daf is Daf Yomi. We left off yesterday by Amar Rabbi Yehuda Beis Amud Beis, by Amar Rabbi Yehuda Ma'aseh Behilim Yamalka. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 lines up in the bottom. So the Gemara says, fine. Remember, both said we are in the midst of. Thank you. Our shir today is sponsored by Karen and Akiva Noach Andrews for the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Marsha Scheinberg, Marsha Bas David. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Mishnah will have an aliyah. So we'll say, remember again, we are in the midst of the fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon in the Mishnah about a sukkah that's lemala me'esrim amos. Sukkah 12 and 20 amos. The Rabbanon saying that it's puzzle. Rabbi Yehuda ultimately saying that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that it is kosher. Rabbi Yehuda is saying that it's kosher. And we saw yesterday 3 different understandings as to why a sukkah lemala me'esrim amos would be puzzle. We then saw 4 different interpretations of the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. So now Rabbi Yehuda is trying to support his position. Rabbi Yehuda, Ma'aseh Behilim Yamalka, Belud, Shahaisa Sukkah Gava Me'esrim Amma. There was an episode of Heleni Amalka, so I spent it off the shir yesterday, speaking about who was Heleni Amalka. She was one of the descendants of the Hasmoni of the Hashmonai Empire. She herself was a very righteous woman, despite the fact that many of her predecessors were not. So the story told about Heleni Amalka, who was sitting in her sukkah in Lud, and her sukkah was 12 and 20 amos. And the elders, the Rabbanim, were walking in and out of the sukkah, and they didn't say anything. So Rabbi Yehuda says, "Oh, what do you see from here? That a sukkah that's lamala me'esrim amma is in fact kosher." Amrlo, they said to Rabbi Yehuda misham raya. That's the best you got, right? That's the raya you're bringing. Number 1, isha haisa uptura min sukkah. Heleni Amalka is a woman. A woman is exempt from sukkah. Sukkah is a mitzvah asesha azman kama. It's a time-bound commandment. So she's exempt. So why would the rabbis have to comment on the kashrus of her sukkah? Amar lahem, to which Rabbi Yehuda responds, "V'lo shiva banim hayula." Aye, but she had 7 sons. Heleni Amalka had 7 sons. V'od kol ma'aseha lo asesa ela al pi chachamim. Furthermore, everything Heleni Amalka did, she did with rabbinic instruction. She did everything by the rabbis. So the Gemara says, why do you need to add in that phrase? And furthermore, everything she ran it by the rabbis. So the Gemara says, this is what it means to say. So remember, the Rabbi Yehuda countered that Heleni Amalka had 7 sons. So the Gemara says, maybe I'll say that her 7 sons were kitanim, were all children. So the Gemara says, well, that's sukkah, and therefore they're pater. Kevan de shiva havu, to which the Gemara responds, since there were 7, and we'll say, we will see later on that the halacha is that katan she'ino tzarech li'imo, a child who does not need his mother, which means when a child is old enough that he does not need to be with his mother every moment of the day. For some people, that takes a very long time, right? So at the moment that the child no longer needs his mother, l'maisa he's chayiv in sukkah. Obviously, before the age of bar mitzvah, he'll still be rabbinically obligated, but he's chayiv in sukkah. So the Gemara says like this: if Heleni Amalka has 7 sons, there's no way that at least one of them must be at the age that he does not need his mother. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, but maybe you'll say, fine, even if there's a son who does not need his mother, that obligation for that child, for that son to be in the sukkah is only midrabanan. Maybe Heleni Amalka was not careful with the rabbanans. Therefore, what does the Brisa say? Tashma v'od kol ma'aseh lo asasa ela al pi chachamim. That's why the Brisa says that everything Heleni Amalka did, she did by the word of the rabbanans. So Rabbi, here's what we have. Heleni Amalka herself may not be chayiv in sukkah, but she definitely has a son that is chayiv in sukkah. Her son maybe is only a chayiv in sukkah the rabbanan. Well, Heleni Amalka is makpedes. She was makpida on the rabbanan. She is careful even with the rabbanans. Now Rabbi Yehuda says, you see my raya. Because Heleni Amalka, who has a son who has the age of chinuch, who's chayiv in sukkah, and Heleni Amalka is careful even with rabbinic obligations like chinuch. The rabbanim are walking in and out of her sukkah. It's the malam esrim amma, and what do they say? Nothing, which indicates that what they blessed her sukkah. That's the malam esrim amma. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Here's my raya." So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Bishlam Lamand Amar Bishain Defanos Magios Asach. Now, both say, remember, now the Gemara is going to go back for a moment, and remember, we interpreted the Machlokes Rabbeinu the Rabbanon to be dealing in different situations. So, according to the Mandam who says Bishain Defanos Magios Asach, this is Rabbi Yoshia. So, according to Rabbi Yoshia, who was the first sheet on with base, who said that the Machlokes Rabbeinu the Rabbanon is only in a case where what? Where the walls don't reach the schach. According to Rabbi Yoshia, if the walls reach the schach, then everyone agrees that a sukkah l'malam me'esrim amma is okay. So according to Mandam, Rabbi Yoshia says that Machlokes says when the walls don't reach the schach, darka shalmaka leishe b'sukkah she'in defanos magios l'schach. So it would be in fact the derech of a queen to sit in a sukkah where the walls don't reach the schach, top of Gimel Y, Mishum Avira. Rabbi say, why would you go ahead and create a sukkah where the walls don't reach the schach? Rashi says Mishum Avira, Ruach Shu Shoy Ba Mipnei HaChom. Because the interesting part is if you leave a gap in between your walls and the schach, then what happens? You allow for airflow. So therefore, according to this approach, this is a good proof for Rabbi Yehuda, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, now we're dealing with the sukkah, she'ein defanos magios l'schach, et lemala me'esrim amma, and yet the Rabbanim didn't say anything about the sukkah. So the Gemara says, but according to Mandama who said that the machlokes Rabbi Rabbanan is in a sukkah kitana, Rabbi said we saw two versions of this machlokes yesterday. Are they arguing about a sukkah that's dalid by dalid? Are they arguing about a sukkah that's rosho, rubo, v'shulchano? Without getting into that right now, the point is that according to the Mandam who says that the machlokes is about a sukkah kitana, v'chi darka shel malka leishe b'sukkah kitana. Would it be the derech of a queen to sit in a small sukkah? Doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabba Barav Ada lo nitzrecha ella l'sukkah ha'asuya kitonios. Oh, what are we talking about over here? A sukkah that was made in compartments. So we'll say if you take the sheet that I gave you, the handout for today, that I keep one. Thank you. So if you look at the sukkah that we're looking at, so this is picture 11. This is what we call a sukkah kitonios. A sukkah made of multiple smaller compartments. So why would Heleni Amalka have a sukkah of kitonios? So the answer would seem to be that this way she had multiple spaces, multiple areas for her entourage. So therefore, again, I will say what you could have over here is a sukkah that, let's say, is pachos midalid al dalid or zayin al zayin, whichever one, and therefore again it was the mala me esrim amma, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda ultimately sees this as a proof to his position that even a sukkah, even what we call the small sukkah, and again whichever shir we're going with, that's the mala me esrim amma, is a kosher sukkah. Because this is what Heleni Amalka is living in, this is what everyone else is living in, and the Rabbanim didn't say anything. So the Gemara says, would a queen live in such a sukkah? To which the Gemara says, the answer is that the queen would live in her ketonis, in her compartment. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. She has one large sukkah for her entourage, for everybody joining her. And there's a smaller compartment for her for modesty purposes. So look at picture number 12. So if you see over here, you're looking at the aerial view, obviously without the schach of what the Gemara was suggesting was the sukkah of Heleni Amalka. So if you'll notice again, what happens? There's like a little compartment over there, a little recessed area. So the Gemara suggests that was the private sukkah of Heleni Amalka. And that sukkah obviously opened up into the much larger sukkah where everyone else was. Now, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is the following, that it could be that the sukkah where Heleni Hamalka herself sat was a small sukkah, less than Dalid by Dalid, less than Zayin al Zayin, but there's a much larger area, obviously, where everyone else is sitting. So what the Rabbanan are now countering back to Rabbi Yehuda. Remember, what did Rabbi Yehuda want to say? Rabbi Yehuda wanted to say that Heleni Hamalka is sitting in a sukkah that's pachos mikashir, that's less than the requisite area, and yet what? And it's l'mala me'esrim amma, and the rabbis didn't say anything. And Rabbi Yehuda wanted to use it as a raya to say what? That a sukkah that's l'mala me'esrim amma is kosher, no matter what the circumstances. What the Gemara now suggests to Rabbi Yehuda is, no, it's not true. True, Heleni Hamalka was sitting in a puzzle sukkah. So why did no one say anything to her? Because she's not chayeves in sukkah. She's not chayeves in sukkah. So why do you have to chat her about the sukkah if she's not chayeves in sukkah? What about everyone else? Everyone else was okay. Why was everyone else okay? Because Rabosai, again, remember, everyone else was sitting in his sukkah. Yes, there was Lamala Me'esrim Amma, but had a much larger area. And remember, again, according to this approach, whether, again, it's Stefanos Magios, the Succah, or a larger area, the point is, in this version of the Gemara, both Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Rabbana will agree that a sukkah that has the requisite area, whatever that is, more than Daled by Daled, or more than Zayin al Zayin, ultimately, even if it's Lamala Me'esrim Amma, will still be kosher. Therefore, the Gemara has effectively refuted this proof of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara, let's read inside. The Gemara says, the rabbi saw that Heleni's sons, whoever were obligated in Sukkah, were sitting in a kasher Sukkah. And she was sitting in her own private Sukkah because of modesty. And because of that, they chose not to say anything to Heleni Amalka. Rabbi Yehuda says, Baneha Gabah Havayasvi. In Rabbi Huda's version of Bosa, no, Heleni was not sitting apart from her sons, but rather what? She was sitting with her sons. She was sitting with her sons. So again, according to Rabbi Huda Bosa, what you'd have to say is that Heleni Amalka was sitting in a sukkah that was less than Daled al Daled with her sons. It could be the rest of the entourage was sitting in the larger sukkah, but she and her sons, including the ones who are now subject to the mitzvah of sukkah, at least midrabanan, were sitting in this sukkah together, and yet the rabbis didn't say anything about lo omri lo davar. And therefore, Rabbi Huda says it's a raya that a sukkah that's lamala me'esrim amma, even if it's a small sukkah, the ma'aseh is still kosher. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar of Shmuel bar Yitzchak halacha. What is the halacha? Tzricha shetei machzekes rosha ruba v'shulchano. Rabbosai, the halacha is that a sukkah must be able, the minimum shear of a sukkah is that it has to be able to hold rosha rubo shulchano. It has to be able to hold your head, the majority of your body, and your tibor. Rabbosai, this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins halacha lemaisa. The area of such a sukkah will be 21 inches squared. So the minimum shear for a sukkah is 21 inches squared. So, which is interesting, by the way. It's very small, but you notice, this is actually a relatively new innovation. You saw they came out a couple of years ago with this pop-up sukkah. So, if you want to just get an idea as to what the minimum shear for a sukkah, that's actually a little bit larger than the minimum shear for a sukkah. But these one-person sukkahs, so that halacha l'maisa is the minimum shear for a sukkah. Rosho rubo shulchano. Amrli Rabbi Abba Kiman. Whose opinion does this reflect? Beis Shammai. It reflects. We'll see where Beis Shammai says in just a moment. It reflects the opinion of Beis Shammai. Amalei Elo Kiman. Who else should we hold like? Meaning, what he's responding is, of course, I hold like Beis Shammai. Ikeda Amri Amar Rabbi Abba Da Amar Lechamani. Rabbi Abba said, who holds like this? Amalei Beis Shammai he Velo Tazuz Mine. It's Beis Shammai Shita, and I will not veer from it. We'll see where Beis Shammai indicates that his position is Rosh Rubo v'Shulchano in just a moment. Mas Kifler Nachem bar Yitzchak. Mimai de Beis Shammai u Beis Hillel besukkah kitana pligi, Dilma besukkah gidola pligi. So we'll say, how do we know that the Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, which we have not yet quoted, but how do we know that the Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is referring to a sukkah kitana? Maybe Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is referring to a sukkah gidola. Now, where would they have Machlokes in a sukkah gidola? Ukigon de Yosef apuma de mitulasa v'shulchano b'soch habayis. And maybe they're arguing in the following case, where you're sitting at the entranceway of the sukkah, and your table is inside the house. I will say, if you turn the page on your handout, you could see over here. First of all, you could see in number 14, that's the minimum shear. In number 4, and the guy's having a little big time in that sukkah over there. It's one big bottle of wine and one small loaf of bread. You can see he's got his hands up in the air. Okay, so that's the minimum shear for sukkah. And also interesting, remember I pointed out to you yesterday that Rosho Rubo v'Shulchan, the way Rashi interpreted it was that why do you have to say Rosho Rubo Shulchan? Why do you say Rosho Rubo? Wherever your head is, that's generally where the majority of your body is. So we pointed out yesterday, Rashi said, because people would eat beheseba, people would eat reclining. So if you're eating reclining, you can have your head in the sukkah, but your body is not there. So it's interesting, the way we define Rosho Rubo v'Shulchano is in a sitting position. That's how you get Rosho Rubo in such a small area. In any event, look at 15. So the Gemara is suggesting over here that maybe the Machlokes Beis Shammai, which we have not yet quoted, is not dealing with the sukkah kitan, not dealing with a small sukkah, but rather dealing with the following case. What happens if a person has a sukkah that is the requisite shear? But what happens? I'm sitting in the sukkah, but if you'll notice, my table is at least somewhat extending into the house. My table's like part of it's in the sukkah, but it's extending into the house. So the Gemara says, "The Beis Shammai Savri Gazrin and Shami Mashechach Shulchano." Beis Shammai is concerned that what home is where your table is, and therefore Lemaisa, if your table extends into your house, what could happen? You're going to end up following the food into the house. Well, and therefore, again, even though the sukkah has the requisite shear, Beis Shammai will hold that such a setup is not good. Beis Hillel's on the other hand, Beis Hillel hold lo gazvinan. Beis Hillel hold no. We're not concerned that you're going to follow your table into the sukkah. As long as part of your table is with you in the sukkah, that's absolutely enough. So the Gemara says, "V'deikanami diktani." Furthermore, a raya to this is that the Mishnah itself says, the Brisa says, "Mishahaya rosho verubo b'sukkah b'shulchano b'socha bayis b'shamai poslin u'b'sila machshirin." What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah spoke about this case explicitly. Someone who had rosho rubo in the sukkah, but his shulchan was in the house. Beis Shammai says it's possible. Ubeis Hillel says it's kosher. V'im isa machzekes ve'ino machzekes mi boile. So we'll say, interestingly enough, if you want to say that the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is about the minimum shear of a sukkah, then the way the Mishnah should read is mishahaya or a sukkah mishahaya rosh rubo b'sukkah shemachziko, something like that lashon. Also with the Gemara, let me take a step back. What happened before is Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok said that the halacha is that a sukkah has to hold Rosh Ruba B'Shulchan. And then Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, where do I get that from? I get that from the position of Beis Shammai. The Gemara then brings down this case over here of talking about where the table is extending into the house, and the Gemara shows you see from here that what? That Beis Shammai requires your table to be in your sukkah. Now somehow Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak understood that to mean that according to Beis Shammai, the minimum shear of a sukkah is that it has to hold Rosho, Rubo, V'Shulchano. All the Gemara is suggesting over here is you can't necessarily understand from this case of where the table extends into the house of the minimum shear that Beis Shammai holds for sukkah. Because again, just because Beis Shammai says that your table has to be inside the sukkah does not automatically translate into Beis Shammai holding that the minimum shear for sukkah is Rosho, Rubo, V'Shulchano. So the Gemara says V'im Isa, because if you want to say that the Machlokes Shammai Sil in the Mishnah is about the minimum shear of sukkah, Machzekes Ve'ena Machzekes Mi Boile. The Mishnah should have spoken about a sukkah and ultimately what it's able to contain within its dimensions. So the Gemara says, Ubasukkah Kitani Lo Pligi. Are you trying to tell me then that Beis Shammai Sil do not argue on the minimum dimensions of a sukkah? But Tanya, we learned Machzekes Rosho Rubo V'Shulchano Kshera, that if a sukkah holds Rosho Rubo V'Shulchano, the sukkah is kosher. Rebbe says Ad Sheyehei Ba Arba Amos Al Arba Amos. Rebbe says no. Also remember the shear of Rosho Rubo V'Shulchano is what? Zayin Tfachim by Zayin Tfachim. So that's the first opinion. Rebbe comes along and says 4 amos by 4 amos, which obviously is significantly larger. V'tanya idach. Furthermore, we have another brayso that says, Rebbe says, Kol sukkah she'in ba arba amos al arba amos psula. Rebbe says any sukkah that doesn't have dimensions of dalar amos by dalar amos is puzzle. The chachamim say afilo eina machzekes ela rosho v'rubo kshera. And yet the chachamim say that what? Even if a sukkah holds rosho v'rubo, and yet interestingly enough, the Gemara picks up the ilu shulchano lo katoni. But yet it doesn't mention anything about the shulchan. Kashan ahadodi. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Elalav shmamina habe shamai habe silal. But rather we see from here that what? That this Mishnah, this brayso, is indicative of a more fundamental machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as to the minimum shear of a sukkah. According to Beis Shammai, the minimum shear of a sukkah is what? Rosho rubo shulchano. According to Beis Hillel, the minimum shear of a sukkah is Rosho Verubo. Rosho Verubo. As long as you don't even have to be able to get your table in there, Rosho Verubo. So the Gemara says, Elash Mamina Habe Shamai Habe Sila. Amar Mazutra. Masnisit Nami Dega. Even the Mishnah that we quoted before seems to bring a riot. So Rabbi say, where we're holding right now is that the machlokes Beis Shammai Sila argue. Actually, I'm not going to say that. I will see it inside in just a moment. So our Mishnah also supports this assertion, namely that Beis Shammai Sila argue about the fundamental minimum dimensions for a sukkah. This midiktani Beis Shammai poslin Ubeis Hillel machshirin. The fact that it uses the lashon Rabosai of pasul and kosher. Vim Isa, and if you want to tell me that Beis Shammai will only argue about what Rabosai, in the case of where you have a large sukkah but the table is inside the house, then what? It should have said Beis Shammai omrim lo yatsa, Ubeis Hillel omrim yatsa mibayle. Rabosai, remember again, in the case of where the table extends into the house, that's not a kosher pasul case. What is that? That's a yatsa lo yatsa case. Why? Because kosher and pasul are only used when referring to the actual dimensions of the sukkah. We learned this already on the Aleph, or not just dimensions, when referring to the details, the building details, the structural details of the sukkah. But when you're talking about details as to where things are positioned, or if I have a kosher sukkah, if I'm utilizing it correctly, that's not kosher pasul. That's yatsa lo yatsa. So the Gemara says ve'ela kashya mishahaya. So we'll say here's the problem. See, just so you understand what we're struggling with over here, because it is a significant struggle. We have essentially one case that where the Mishnah records imachlus b'sham ve'silal, and it's in this case of picture 15. It's this case over here again of where the guy's sitting in a sukkah and his table extends into his house. And what happens? Beis Shammai says you're not. Beis Shammai says lo yatsa, and Beis Hillel says yatsa. But yet we also see from this case that what? That lemaisa, they're also arguing on the dimensions of a sukkah. But yet the minimum dimensions of a sukkah. That Beis Shammai says it has to be rosh haruba v'shulchano, and Beis Hillel says it's enough that it's just rosh haruba. The question is, how does this shtim? So how do we see that fundamental machlokes to Beis Shammai Beis Hillel on the minimum dimensions of a sukkah from this case of Misha Haya, Rosh of Ruba B'Sukkah, V'Shulchana B'Socha Bais, to which the Gemara answers, the Olam B'Tarti Pligi. Beis Shammai Beis argue in two cases. They argue Pligi B'Sukkah Kitana or Pligi B'Sukkah Gidola. There are two machloks from Beis Shammai Beis. One is when we say Sukkah Kitana means the minimum dimensions of a Sukkah, and they also argue on Sukkah Gidola, which means this case of Misha Haya Rosha V'Ruba B'Sukkah, V'Shulchano B'Socha Bais, V'Chisuri Mechsura V'Achikatani. And in reality, there is a piece missing from the Mishnah, and here's how it must read. Part 1. Misha Haya Rosha V'Ruba B'Sukkah V'Shulchano B'Socha Bais. Case number 1, somebody sitting in the sukkah, but their table's inside the house. Beis Shammai omrim lo yatsa. Beis Shammai says you are not yotze. Ubeis Hillel omrim, Beis Hillel says yatsa. Beis Hillel says you're yotze. Furthermore, machlokes number 2, v'she'ena machzekes ela kedei rosho v'rubo bilvad. And about a sukkah that only could contain your head and most of your body and not your table. Beis Shammai poslin. Ubeis Hillel machshirin. Beis Shammai says it's possible. Beis Hillel says it's kosher. So Rabbi say this is the bottom line. We have two machlokas in Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Case number 1, Mishaya Rosho Berubo Besocha Sukkah V'Shulchano Besocha Bayis. Case number 1, Beis Shammai Pasul, Beis Hillel kosher. Case number 2, Sukkah that only holds Rosho Verubo, Beis Shammai Pasul, Beis Hillel kosher. Man Tan Lahadatan Rabbanan. Who is the opinion reflected in the following brisa? She'ein bo arba amos al arba amos. I will say, if you have a structure, this is actually a very interesting Gemara. If you have a structure that is less than dalid by dalid, structure that's less than, and this is amos now. 4 amos, remember, 4 amos is approximately, called 6 feet. 6 feet. All right, so if somebody has a structure that's less than 6 feet by 6 feet, number 1, pata min mezuzah. Such a structure is not subject to mezuzah. Number 2, min ha-ma'akeh. It's not subject to mezuzah. Also, remember, halach l'maisa, if you have a structure with a flat roof, you must go ahead and put a ma'akeh. You must put a fence, protect the fence around that roof. Number 3, ve'eno matami b'nigoyim. Rabbi said there's a concept of tsara'as habayis. A home that is less than dalid by dalid is not subject to the laws of tsara'as habayis. Next, let's count. Ve'eno nechlat babate arichoma. I'll say another very interesting halacha. If you go ahead, like Rashi, ve'eno nechlat ela podeli olam b'yotze b'yovel im lo galo kishar karka lo binyan. We'll say the halacha is when you sell a home in a walled city, there's a very interesting, normally when you sell property, so you have the ability to redeem that property whenever you want, and if you don't redeem it, what happens? Comes the yovel year, property goes back to its original owners. There's one notable exception to this, which is if you sell property in a walled city. If you sell property in a walled city, you have 1 year to redeem it. If you don't exercise your right of redemption the first year, then what happens? It's gone. It doesn't come back to yovel either. The Sefer HaChinuch explains that the reason for this is because walled cities were often border cities. Border cities were necessary for the security of Eretz Yisrael. The security of the city is totally dependent on what? The residents knowing each other and the residents knowing the city. If you have constant turnover of ownership in the properties in the walled city, you're going to undermine the security not just of the city, but undermine the security of Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, the Torah makes this special stipulation. You've got 1 year to redeem your property. If you don't do it, it's gone, and it's gone forever. So if you have a structure that's less than Dalid al Dalid in a walled city, this concept does not apply. And I will say again, remember in Kiseites, the Torah speaks about the different reasons why a soldier would be permitted to not have to fight. To not have to fight. So one of the reasons that the Gemara quotes is what? Is that somebody who built a home. Misha banabayis v'lo chanacho. So you can imagine, Yanko raises his hand, I just put up a shed. And I put up a shed in the backyard. I really should go back. It's on my mind. It was beautiful. It was nice to have my lawnmower, my snowblower. So the Gemara says not so quick. If you have a structure that's less than Dalid by Dalid, you don't go back from war for that. Next, ve'in ma'arvin bo, ve'in mishtatvin bo, ve'in manichin bo eruv. So such a home that's less than Dalid by Dalid is not part of eruv chaseros. Remember again, I will say back to our eruvin days. You have multiple homes that open up into one chaser. In order to be able for the homes to carry into the chaser, the homes have to join together to form one collective ownership unit. How do they do that? Everybody contributes bread in order to go ahead and be part of the eruv. Halacha l'maisa, a home that's less than Dalid al Dalid need not contribute towards the eruv. Next, ve'in mishtatvin bo. Rabbi says shitufei muvos. Remember again, you have multiple chatzeros that open up into one mavoi. In order for the residents of the chaser to carry into the mavoi, what has to happen? Everybody has to join together in another eruv-like thing. If you have one mavoi, and or one mavoi that only has a structure of less than Dalid by Dalid, that mavoi does not, one chaser that has a structure that's less than Dalid al Dalid, that structure need not join in with the shituf muvos. Why? Because l'maisa again, it's insignificant. Ve'in manichin bo'eruv. Furthermore, if you have a structure that's less than Dalid al Dalid, that structure in the eruv chatzeros, you must place the collected food in one space, in one home. You can't place the eruv food in a structure that's less than Dalid by Dalid on the base. Ve'in osin oso ibur ben shtei ayars. Well, it's another very interesting case. Quickly, only because timing. Otherwise, you'd have a lot more time to go into all these things. This is back to eruvin. Remember again, the halacha is you have a concept of a tchum. Tchum says you have 2,000 amos from the edge of your city. Chazal gave a city what's called a karfev. A karfev is an area of 70 and 2/3 amos. 70 and 2/3 amos. So each city is essentially considered to have like an external boundary of 70 and 2/3 amos. Technically speaking, and the tchum, by the way, would be measured from the edge of the karfev. Technically speaking, if you have city A and city B, and city A and city B are, let's say, within 141 amos of each other, then what ends up happening? They actually form one large tchum. One large tchum because their karfevs overlap, and therefore that allows them to be considered like one entity. To take that a step further, if you have two cities that are exactly 141 and 1/3 amos apart, which means that their two karfevs end exactly at each other. They don't overlap, they end at each other, and you have a house, you have a home, a residence, that sits mamish on top of those boundaries, so it straddles the two boundaries. That house joins the two cities into one extended tchum. So what the Gemara is saying over here is, if that house, so to speak, is a structure that is less than Dalid by Dalid, then what? It doesn't work. Furthermore, ve'ein ha'achin ba'shutfin cholkin bo, and also brothers or partners can't split this up. Now I will say, what does that mean? If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, "Ve'in achin o shutfin cholkin bo, kaslat kadait chahashta shin yecholin lokov zeh lechalik lefi she'in bo kidei lezeh." So we'll say, what the Gemara is talking about now, although we will challenge this later on, is that if you have two partners who happen to share together in a structure that is less than Dalid by Dalid, one can't force the other to split up the property. One of the interesting things in halachic business partnerships is one partner has the right to cause the other to dissolve the partnership. to dissolve the partnership. Now, Chazal often speak about this in terms of property, real property, but it also applies in other areas as well. So what the Havamina is that if two people, Reuven and Shimon, own this structure that's less than Daled by Daled, neither Reuven nor Shimon could compel upon the other to split the property. We'll see what this means in just a little bit. So the Gemara says, whose opinion is this? So now they'll say, what's the common denominator among all of these things? Common denominator. What's the take-home message? A structure that is less than Daled Amos by Daled Amos is not significant. It's not significant. I will say, again, truth is, we don't really care right now about any of these cases except the one that's not mentioned here, which is Sukkah. So the Gemara says, Lema, whose opinion is reflected over here? So the Gemara says, Lema Rebbe, it must be Rebbe. Why? The lo Rabbanon, and not the Rabbanon, I will say. Why? Look at Rashi. Lema Rebbe, the lo chashiv Sukkah, but Sirme Daled Amos. Because remember, we had Rebbe already on Beis and Beis teaching us that what? That a Sukkah must at least have dimensions of Daled al Daled, and not the Rabbanon. So the Gemara said, look at Rashi. V'lo Rabbanon, dechihechi demachshri b'Sukkah, Alma dirahi v'huadin l'chol milei debayis. So Rabbi say it must now remember the Rabbanon hold that even a sukkah that's less than Daled by Daled, as long as it holds Rosh Rubo v'Shulchano, is going to be enough. Then Rabbi say it would appear that Rebbe, who says that a structure that's less by Daled is not good for sukkah, that's because he holds a structure less than Daled by Daled is insignificant, and that's why again all of these things just mentioned over here make perfect sense according to Rebbe. However, according to the Rabbanon, who say that even a sukkah that's less than Daled by Daled is a kosher sukkah, they should also say what? That for all of these things mentioned over here, that a structure less than Daled by Daled should also be chayiv in mezuzah, chayiv in makir, all the things mentioned over here. To which the Gemara says, no. To which the Gemara says, afilu timur Rabbanon. No, it's not true. The brayse that we just quoted before that exempts a structure that's less than Daled by Daled from all of these halachic details could even be according to the Rabbanon. Why? Ad kan lo k'mer Rabbanon hasam ela le'inyan sukkah the diras arayhi. So the Gemara says, no. Why the Rabbanon machshir a sukkah that's less than Daled by Daled? It's not because they hold that less than Daled by Daled is called a structure. It's fakir, just the opposite. It's because sukkah is a diras aray. It's because sukkah is a temporary dwelling, and because of that, Rabbi Musa, it need not conform to the regular basic obligations of what creates a structure. Therefore, lemaisa, again, when it comes to sukkah, they say that a structure less than Daled by Daled is good. But in all of these other cases, what? They would hold that a structure would have to be Daled by Daled as well. So the aval legabe bayis, the diras kevahu, when it comes to a home which is supposed to be a permanent structure, afilu rabbanon motu, even the rabbis agree, if it has Daled by Daled, then people would live in it. Ve'ilo, and if not, lo daribe inshi, people would not live in it. So I will say what comes out over here is the following. What comes out Lamaisa is number one, that both Rebbe and the Rabbanon will agree, that in all of these cases that we just mentioned over here, in order for a structure to be considered a house, which is the common denominator of all of these halachic obligations, it has to be Daled al Daled. The machlokis is by a sukkah. The Rabbanon hold that by a sukkah, because it's diras aray, it can even be pachos mi Daled al Daled, whereas Rebbe holds that for a sukkah, because it's whereas Rebbe holds that for a sukkah, even though it is diras aray, it must conform to the basic dimensions of a domicile, which means that it still has to be Daled al Daled. So now the Gemara is going to go through this whole list. Amaran, Pater min amezuzah, min amaka, ve'en amatami bin negoim, ve'en nechla pater eichama, ve'en chozral me'orchem elchama. So the Gemara now says, my time, what's the reason why a structure that's less than Daled by Daled is exempt of all of these things? My time, the bias ksiv behu bekulu. Because we're both saying all of these things, the Torah says bias. The Torah says that you require a home. You require a home for mezuzah. You require a home for protective fence. You require a home for tzaras habayis. You require a home for the laws of 1 year redemption for a home in a walled city. You require a home to be able to return from work. So the Torah uses lashon of bias for all of these things, and the minimum definition of a bias is what? Daled Amos by Daled Amos. Ve'ein ma'arvin bo, ve'ein mishtatzvin bo, ve'ein manichin bo eruv. Furthermore, again, such a home does not need to contribute to the eruv. Such a home does not need to contribute to shituf muvaos, and for such a home you may not place the eruv chatzeros inside of it. My time, what's the reason? Delochazi ladira, because such a home is not fit for living in. And I said, when we say fit for living in, we mean on a permanent basis. The definition of a home is not a place where you could spend the night. The definition of a home is a place where you could set up a residence. So all of these things, meaning in order to be obligated to contribute to the Erev Chatzeros, in order to be obligated to contribute to the Shituf Muvos, in order to be able to be a place that is fit to place the collected Erev, you have to satisfy domicile requirements. You have to be a place where people could live. Pachos midalad al dalad, people can't live there. Eruv chatzeros in manichinbo. So interestingly enough, although you can't place an eruv chatzeros in it, aval shituf manichinbo. But Rabbi say, what can you do? You can go ahead and place shituf muvos. Remember, also, what's shituf muvos? Remember, shituf muvos means you have multiple chatzeros opening up into a mavui. A mavui is like an alleyway that leads out to Rosh Hashanah. In order for the people to carry from their chatzar, remember, they're carrying from their home into the chatzar through the vehicle of Erev Chatzeros. In order to be able to carry from the chatzar into the mavui, you need something called shituf muvos. So the Gemara now says, however, that although if you have one chatzar and all that chatzar has in it is a home that's less than daled al daled, that home or that chatzar need not contribute to the shituf muvos. Yet, interestingly enough, you could take the collected food of the shituf muvos and you could place it where? Inside that house, inside that structure of daled al daled. So the Gemara says, my time out. Why is that? Dilogara michatzer sheva mavui, because Rabbi say that chatzar or that home, I should say, which is less than daled al daled, is no worse than one of the chatzeros that borders the mavui. This none we learned. Eruve chatzeros b'chatzer. You place an eruv chatzeros in the chatzar. Shitufe mavui b'mavui, and you place the shituf mavos in the mavui. So Gemara says, what does that mean? But we ask about that. Eruv chatzeros b'chatzar. Is that true that you place the eruv chatzeros in the chatzar? But we learned hanosin eruvo bebeis shar achsadra umir pesas eno eruv. We learned back in our eruvin days that if you place your eruv in a beis shar, beis shar is a gatehouse, achsadra is a portico, mir pesas is like pesas literally is like a terrace. It's when people lived in two-story structures, so there would be like a terrace area. People would walk out of their homes. There must be a better word than terrace for it. But they walk on the terrace in front of them. You can't place an Erev Chatzeros in any of these places. Where does an Erev Chatzeros have to be placed? Erev Chatzeros has to be placed in a home. Furthermore, V'hadar sham eino oser. And if one lives in one of these areas, one goes to live in the gatehouse, one lives in the Achsadra, one lives in the Merpesas, these are not considered real domiciles, and therefore Lemaisa, they would not restrict the mobility of the other members of the Chatzar. Rather, what does the Brayso say? Therefore, what does it mean that you're placing the Erev in the Chatzar, that you're placing the Mavui, in the sheet of Mavos in the Mavui? So the Gemara says, rather, what does it mean? When you make an Erev Chatzeros, which again, remember, everybody's contributing food, placing that food in one place in the Chatzar, that makes it like the Chatzar is owned by one person, which then allows everyone to carry from their home into the Chatzar. Where do you place that food? Bebayis Sheba that must be placed in a home. V'shitufe muvos b'chatzar sheva mavui, and you have to place the shituf muvos in one of the chatzeros. V'hai lo gara mechatzar sheva mavui. And Rabbi said the halacha is now that you could place the shituf muvos in the chatzer, or I should say in the home that's less than daled by daled. Why? Because that home that's less than daled by daled essentially is insignificant, is nothing. It's no different than placing the shituf muvos in the chatzer itself, which is permitted. Ve'in osin oso ibor ben shtei ayaros, and furthermore, you can't go ahead, remember, and make this home that's less than daled al daled into the ibor, literally into the connection between the two karfeifs between two cities. Da'afilu ki bargainin lo mishavin alei. It's not even like a hut. I will say, if you look at Rashi, bargainin, it's the fourth white line on the bottom of Rashi. Tzrif sha'osin min arava v'kanim l'shomrei peros u'letzai de ovos. V'tanya be'iruvin v'ketzad me'arvin. Bargainin mis'avinim. And I've also, it's very interesting. So bargainin was like a little hut. It was made out of reeds, made out of willow branches. And why would they do it? It was a structure to provide shelter for people who are out in the fields, either watching the fruit, or for people, or for hunters. So also, here's what's interesting. The Gemara says that bargainin, this little hut, can in fact create a connection between the two cities, which means, so imagine, if you have a hut, so you have two city A, city B, and literally their karfeifs end right at each other. They border each other, but they not overlap. And you have a bargainin, and you have a hut that sits on top of these two borders. That hut joins the two cities. Now this is very dramatic because why should a structure less than dalid by dalid be any worse than a bargaining? To which the Gemara says, my taima, bargain is a very interesting idea. My taima, bargaining, chazalim sayu, v'hai lo chazalim say. I will say, you know why? Because lemaisa, a bargaining may be small, but a bargaining fulfills its purpose. The job of a bargaining is to be small and to be able to offer temporary shelter to the hunter or to the person who's watching the fruit. On the other hand, lemaisa, a home is supposed to be what the say, supposed to be able to provide permanent residence, and a home that's pachos midalad al dalid cannot do that. So essentially, what the Gemara says is that in order for a structure to be a valid structure, it has to what? It has to fulfill its purpose. It's incredible. There's a message in that. There's a message in that as well, a deeper message. And in order for a structure to be a structure, it has to fulfill its purpose. If it looks like a structure but doesn't actually do anything in life, it doesn't fulfill its purpose, then the Lamaisa it's not halachically viable, and therefore not fulfill all of these criteria. So the Gemara says, "Vashutvin cholkin bo." Furthermore, again, the ein ha'achin ha'shutvin cholkin bo, and brothers who are partners cannot split this area. So the Gemara says, "Taima de lespe dalid." The reason why brothers can't force a division over here is why? Because the area doesn't have dalid amas. Ha ispe dalid cholkin, but the inference would be what bro said, that if the structure did have dalid amas, brothers or partners would be able to demand. When we say brothers, by the way, brothers is in the context of Yerusha. The brothers jointly inherit something from their father. So the mashmos is that what? That if it had dalid, they would be able to order a division. But we learned but yet we learned elsewhere that what? That you can't force division of property unless what, Rabbosai? Unless each partner or each brother is going to walk away with a minimum of daled amos. I'm going to leave you with that question. We'll stop over here. We'll pick up mamish with this teretz tomorrow. So Rabbosai, again, just to review, we do come out with something very, very important over here. A very important piece of halacha l'maisad with Shulchan Aruch Paskins. The minimum share for a sukkah is rosho, rubo, v'shulchano. That's number one. The other important piece of information to remember today, machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is in two areas. Number one, the minimum share of a sukkah. Beis Shammai holds rosho, rubo, shulchano. Beis Hillel holds rosho, rubo. Interestingly enough, we paskin like Beis Shammai in this particular circumstance, and it has all rosho, rubo, shulchano. Number two, machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanan about the minimum dimensions of a structure are only legabi sukkah, because sukkah is a dira sarai. But even Rabbi would agree with the Rabbanan that for any kind of permanent structure, a permanent structure must always have minimum dimensions of daled amos by daled amos, because any home that's less than daled amos by definition does not serve the function of a home. All right, we'll pick up Emir Hashem with the Achen Shachol Gu tomorrow.
Oh yeah, see him tonight?